So sports is not really a topic I cover on this channel much, and in general the Minecraft community and gaming community doesn't tend to overlap strongly with traditional sports, but if you're a Brit there's a good chance you're into football or from Europe as well, and I know some of you in my audience will be interested in what everyone in football is talking about at the moment, which is the creation of a new European Super League. This is like a breakaway franchise where there are, I believe, 12 clubs committed to joining a new league that will take place in midweek football and potentially replace the Champions League. So the clubs involved are Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, Tottenham. They got Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Atletico Madrid from Spain, and then Inter Milan, AC Milan, and Juventus. These are all the teams that have agreed to join. I think Paris Saint-Germain and one of the German teams have rejected the proposal. Now, the reason this is kind of like a big deal, I think, is because of the reaction that people are having to it. If you're invested in sports and how the structure of sports works in European and English football, this is very, very different to what they do in America. If you're an American sports enthusiast, then this doesn't sound like such a big deal. But essentially, they're creating a league in which they can't be relegated from, and that they will play each other. These are some of the most attractive games for business when the big clubs of different countries come together and play one another. So what's fascinating about this is that the narrative of greed and money comes right to the forefront from so many different people, including the UEFA establishment that run these competitions. And I happen to agree. This is obviously what's fueling all of this. These clubs want to, or the owners of these clubs want to make a lot of money and build a closed-in, invite-only system where there are no penalties for poor performance, i.e. getting relegated from a league or missing out on playing in a particular competition. And that is a big part of the spirit of the English game and the European game, is the idea that it's a pyramid structure and any team can technically win the biggest trophy. It takes time, but all of the smallest levels of the sport are connected to the biggest levels. Over here in the UK, one of the things I really love is the FA Cup competition, where every year it feels like there's some small team from some lower league, rising up and playing some of the bigger teams in the lower levels, and there's always lower level teams coming up to play teams from the Premier League, and it just makes for really exciting football. Something that I really enjoy as a neutral watching on, and quite a passionate fan of football. It's enjoyable. Enjoyed it a lot more in my youth than I do these days. But anyway, the thing that I wanted to comment on with this video was more so about the narrative that has emerged, this anti-greed sentiment, this anti-money sentiment, because in my mind, before this happened, it would be the UEFA and some of the governing bodies like the Premier League that you could make the argument or have the sentiment towards that they are, the greed and the money, air quotes, and the Premier League had created a sort of top four that then became a top six group when it was formed. Before that, you did have some dominant teams from time to time, like Manchester United and then Liverpool. But other teams won stuff in between, and since the formation of the Premier League, it tended to be the same clubs winning it over and over again, and then the Champions League kind of solidified that for not only over here in England, but in other countries like Spain as well, where Real Madrid and Barcelona just, hand the title back and forth to one another. And the Champions League money sort of further reinforced that. But the new clubs that have come into that game, like Manchester City, have done so with massive amounts of money behind them. It's become a game so heavily influenced by money. And the sort of sentiment that is being directed towards this European Super League is the kind of sentiment you would hear rumblings of directed towards UEFA and the Premier League from people who are critical of it in that angle, that those things previously needed to change because it had become too much about money and it had become too dominated by certain clubs. Well, this very bold move that the clubs have made has now brought that to the forefront. So if they do break away, I think it will be bad for football, but it will probably be one of those things that's generational, that people will just get used to. Young fans growing up won't know how it used to be and just accept it the way it is. And I think a good comparison is to look at the American system and just realize that there's no wrong or right way to do sports. In America, you have franchises and you have safety nets for clubs where there is no relegation and no tumbling down the different leagues. It's sort of like an agreed upon system where everyone plays each other, and that's fine. But the thing is, if the Americans were to then switch to doing the promotion and relegation system, they would probably have a similar kind of reaction because it's just different from what you know. And so, this being so different, people are opposed to it. The motivation behind it is undoubtedly money. These clubs are going to make 3.5 billion for participating in it. So I don't think there's any question there about the motivations and what's going into it. But yeah, people will have that knee-jerk reaction to change. But over time, if this thing gets established, 20 years, 30 years, the rumblings will quiet down once the dust has settled, and this thing could potentially actually just continue onwards and be its own thing that people end up accepting. Now, immediately, lots of critics, big voices in the football community, the establishment as well of UEFA and the Premier League, even the government over here in the UK are coming in and making statements about strong sanctions and punishments for doing this, the possibility of ejecting these clubs from the Premier League and from other competitions, and it's going to be so fascinating to see how it plays out because the timing, it almost seems very tone deaf. To echo some words that Gary Neville said, they're doing this at a time when the football system is struggling because of the pandemic, and what it needs is money in its grassroots. And here are the top clubs trying to separate and make even more money. It is just a mad time to do this, but maybe actually it's a clever time to do it because fans aren't in stadiums where they can be very vocal, and even if people to be organised and demonstrate, it's at a time where less people will be willing to participate for obvious reasons. And if this breakaway happens, there could be some really big punishments because they're already talking about expelling clubs who participate in it from various competitions. This could mean the likes of Arsenal, Chelsea and Liverpool disappearing from the Premier League, which is kind of sad really. It would mean a lot more other clubs would have a chance at winning the league season to season, but to see a fracture like that, you know, for the tradition of football and for how long these clubs have competed against one another, it would be a relatively sad thing, in my opinion, overall, to see something like that happen. And my last thought on this topic is that there could be an upside to all this, probably unlikely, but where the response has been so overwhelmingly against this, it may empower UEFA and whatnot to penalise some of the greed in the game and roll it back. However, as I said earlier, I would be the sort of person to look at those institutions before an event like this and feel like they are responsible to some extent for creating monopolies within the game where the same few clubs seem to win it over and over again through letting them have such financial influence into the game. What could become positive of this is that they recall some of that power from the finance of the game to ensure something like this wouldn't happen again in the future. It might be able to make football fairer overall. The other way you could look at this is that they might walk it back a little bit. They come out with something that people disagree against and they walk back some of the ideas, but they're still going to set up some sort of league. This is the kind of thing that happens on console launches, I've noticed. They always come out with DRM, online only, and you can't use borrowed games, and then they walk back some of the restrictions, but they leave a few in there from what you had in the previous generation. So it could play out that way as well. This is going to be utterly fascinating to watch and see what plays out in the future. And so far what we've seen is the announcement, and the clubs have held their position on what they're going to do. And so from here, you know, it looks like it's going to get ugly. There's probably going to be penalties imposed on these clubs, and who knows how far it will go, or maybe they will give in and withdraw the idea at some point. It's all just a waiting game, and it'll all be very interesting to watch unfold.